The morning his grandson called to tell him how incredible the graduation party had been, Arthur Sterling was sitting at his kitchen table in Bend, Oregon. He was nursing his second cup of black coffee, quietly watching the late spring snow melt off the Douglas firs bordering the lake. It had struck him as odd when the phone rang at 7:30 on a Sunday. 18-year-olds didn't call their grandfathers at the crack of dawn unless something was terribly wrong or wonderfully right. "Grandpa, you should have seen the venue," Leo said, his voice brimming with leftover adrenaline. The lights, the catering, everything was perfect. Arthur set his ceramic mug down on the wood table, very slowly. "When exactly did this happen, Leo?" he asked. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a heavy, suffocating silence that lasted just long enough for Arthur's stomach to plummet. "Last Saturday," the boy finally answered, the joy faltering in his voice. "Dad didn't tell you?" Arthur forced a warm, steady tone. He smoothly lied, saying he must have mixed up his calendar, told Leo how much he loved him, and promised they would celebrate together soon. Then, he hung up the phone. He pushed his chair back, walked to the vast living room windows, and stood there for a very long time, just watching the cold, gray peaks of the Cascade Mountains. Arthur did not feel the sudden, explosive burst of anger he might have expected. At 68, a retired structural engineer who had spent his life calculating load-bearing limits and stress fractures, he knew that catastrophic collapses rarely happened with a loud bang. They happened quietly, after years of ignored microscopic cracks. The betrayal he felt now was a silent, architectural failure within his own family. He turned away from the mountains. The house was entirely still, the only sound being the faint hum of the refrigerator. He walked down the hallway to his study, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The room smelled of old paper and leather, a sanctuary where he usually spent his mornings reading. He sat at his heavy oak desk, opened the bottom right drawer, and pulled out a fresh yellow legal pad alongside a thick folder of bank statements he kept meticulously filed. Arthur picked up a silver pen. His hand, usually steady, hovered over the lined paper. For 12 years, he had operated under a delivered blindness. He had framed every financial rescue as a fatherly duty, an investment in his son's future, a way to build a bridge over the vast, empty spaces he had created during his demanding career. Today, that blindness evaporated, he began to write. He did not write narratives or excuses. He wrote numbers. At the top of the page, he wrote the year 12 years ago. That was when Marcus and Chloe had decided they absolutely needed a 4-bedroom house in the prestigious neighborhood of Lake Oswego. They had been significantly short on the down payment. Marcus had looked at him with a familiar, desperate exhaustion, and Arthur had written a check to secure his grandchildren a proper backyard. $45,000. He wrote the words down, carefully shaping each letter on the yellow paper. A few lines below, he documented the kitchen renovation. Chloe had casually left glossy design magazines open on the coffee table during his visits, pointing out imported marble countertops and custom cabinetry. Marcus had quietly confessed they were stretched far too thin to afford it. Arthur had stepped in again, interest-free, with no timeline for repayment. $15,000. Then came the vehicles. When Marcus's transmission failed, they were somehow out of savings again. Arthur bought him a reliable, high-end sedan so he could commute safely. $12,000. He added the orthodontics for his granddaughter, which their dental plan miraculously did not cover. He listed the private lacrosse camp fees, the sudden emergency plumbing repair when their basement flooded, and the insurance payout fell short. He listed the 2 family vacations to Maui, trips he had organized and paid for entirely, hoping to create golden memories. He remembered walking on the beach, watching the kids play in the surf, telling himself the expense was an unconditional gift of love. $11,000 for flights, oceanfront cottages, and dinners out. His pen moved relentlessly down the yellow page. Every single time Marcus and Chloe had reached the edge of their financial capabilities, Arthur had been there, a permanent, unquestioning safety net. He had never asked for a repayment plan. He had never drawn up a contract. He had simply opened his wallet, desperate to feel necessary to the family he had neglected in his youth. Finally, at the very bottom, he wrote down the cost of the graduation party. $40,000. Early in the spring, Marcus had called to say they wanted to give Leo a night he would never forget. Chloe had found the perfect waterfront venue, an elite catering service, and a professional photographer. Marcus had lamented the exorbitant costs, using that specific, calculated tone he had perfected over a decade. Arthur had swallowed the bait willingly. He had wired the deposits directly to the vendors. He had paid for the dream, booked his flight, and reserved his hotel room, eagerly anticipating the proud moment he would watch his grandson celebrate. And they had held the party without him. 5 entire weeks early. Arthur drew a thick, definitive line beneath the final entry. He performed the mental math, adding the figures together. The total stared back at him from the yellow paper. $250,000. $250,000 transferred over 12 years, not including Christmas gifts, birthdays, or the occasional grocery run when he visited. $250,000 spent to buy a position in his son's life, only to be entirely discarded on the most important night of his grandson's youth. Arthur set the pen down. He leaned back in his leather chair, the leather creaking softly in the quiet room. The numbers on the pad were not just a financial record. They were a devastating psychological diagnosis. He saw clearly now that he and his son were locked in a toxic ecosystem. Marcus and Chloe lived at the absolute upper edge of their income by choice, maintaining an illusion of wealth to impress their affluent neighbors, fully aware that Arthur would always bridge the gap. He had taught his son that there were no consequences for poor planning. He had taught them that his love had no boundaries, no conditions, and ultimately, no self-respect. The silence in the study was profound, a chilling realization settling deep into Arthur's bones. He had paid $250,000 to avoid trusting his son to be a man. He had funded his own exclusion. He closed his eyes, the image of the yellow legal pad burning behind his eyelids, knowing that the structural integrity of his family was completely broken, and he was the one who had funded the demolition. The yellow legal pad lay flat on the heavy oak desk, glowing under the warm light of the brass reading lamp. Arthur stared at the final sum. $250,000. The numbers began to blur, losing their shape as currency and morphing into a precise, damning measurement of his own paternal guilt. The study around him seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the ghosts of his past demanded to be acknowledged. He closed his eyes and let the silence of the Bend house fade, replaced by the deafening, rhythmic roar of the Boeing assembly plant in Everett. 30 years ago, Arthur Sterling was not a man who wrote checks. He was a man who drew lines, calculated stress loads, and ensured that hundreds of tons of metal could defy gravity safely. He was a brilliant structural engineer, consumed by the absolute perfection required to build airplanes. But his obsession with the sky left him completely untethered from the ground. His mind was perpetually filled with blueprints, wind tunnel data, and titanium stress thresholds. There was simply no room left for parent-teacher conferences, weekend camping trips, or quiet dinners at home. The memory of a specific Tuesday evening in late May surfaced with brutal clarity. Marcus was 12 years old, playing in the district championship baseball game. Arthur had promised, swearing on his life, that he would leave the Everett plant early. He had even bought Marcus a pristine leather fielder's glove, sitting boxed on the passenger seat of his car. But an unexpected microfracture in a wing spar prototype had been discovered during stress testing. Arthur had stayed. He had told himself that the safety of future passengers was paramount, a noble excuse he used to justify his absence. He remembered driving home past midnight, the box with the glove still on the passenger seat. He walked into the dark kitchen and found his wife sitting at the table, her face illuminated by the dim stove light. She did not yell. She did not cry. She simply told him that Marcus had struck out in the final inning, looking toward the empty bleachers the entire time. Arthur had crept into his son's bedroom, placing the glove on the nightstand. The next morning, Marcus had pushed the glove into the back of his closet without a word. The boy never played baseball again. That quiet disappointment became the permanent foundation of their relationship. Marcus grew up, went to college, and moved out, always maintaining a polite, impenetrable distance from his father. Arthur had spent those decades rationalizing his choices. He told himself he was providing a spectacular life, building a fortress of financial security that would outlast them all. He equated a fully funded college trust with a father's love. He confused the act of providing with the act of being present. Then came retirement. The grueling schedule stopped. The blueprints were rolled up and stored away. His wife passed away shortly after, a quiet surrender to illness that left Arthur rattling around a massive, empty house with a gold retirement watch and a heart full of suffocating regrets. He realized too late that he had successfully engineered a fortune, but he had entirely failed to build a family. When Marcus married Chloe, Arthur saw a second chance. He could not travel back in time to sit in those aluminum bleachers, but he could pave their future with gold. The first time Marcus mentioned the struggle to afford a home in Lake Oswego, Arthur felt a sudden, desperate surge of purpose. Writing that first check for $45,000 felt like an act of redemption. When he handed the envelope to Marcus, he saw a glimmer of the admiration he had craved for decades. The transactions quickly became a twisted psychological dependency. Every time Chloe hinted at a financial shortfall, every time Marcus looked tired and defeated by the crushing cost of their affluent lifestyle, Arthur felt a perverse sense of relief. They needed him. He was finally essential. He became their permanent safety net, eager to solve every crisis with his bank account. He paid for the kitchen, the cars, the vacations, and the orthodontics because every cleared check temporarily silenced the phantom memory of a 12-year-old boy looking for his father in an empty crowd. But sitting here now, looking at the yellow pad, the illusion shattered into jagged pieces. The money had not bought redemption. It had not erased the past. It had only mutated Marcus's childhood resentment into adult entitlement. Arthur had used his wealth as a time machine, trying to buy back the years he had thrown away at Boeing. Instead, he had created a monster. He had willingly funded a system where his son learned to view him not as a father to be loved, but as an endless resource to be mined. The betrayal of the graduation party was not just about the money or the secret date. It was the agonizing proof that his strategy had completely failed. Chloe had easily erased him from the celebration because, to her, he was not family. He was a bank vault, and nobody invited the vault to a party. They just took the cash and locked the door. A sudden, sharp tightness gripped Arthur's chest. The air in the study felt stagnant, heavy with the dust of his own failures. He could not sit in this room any longer. He needed cold air. He needed the vast, indifferent expanse of the outdoors to wash away the cloying stench of his mistakes. He reached for his cell phone on the desk, bypassing his son's name in the contacts. He dialed the number of Frank, his oldest friend, a man who had spent his life pouring concrete and possessed a terrifyingly clear vision of the world. Arthur listened to the phone ring, desperately needing someone to pull him out of the wreckage he had built. Frank picked up on the fourth ring. His voice carried the rough texture of a man who had smoked cigars for 40 years. Arthur did not offer a greeting. He simply asked if the old aluminum skiff was fueled and ready. Frank did not ask for an explanation. He told Arthur to be at the marina in 45 minutes. That was the profound comfort of a friendship spanning 3 decades. Frank was not a man who filled empty spaces with unnecessary noise. Arthur drove through the winding roads toward the lake. The heater in his truck blasted warm air, but a deep chill remained anchored in his chest. When he arrived, Frank was already at the dock, untying the mooring lines. The morning mist was thick, clinging to the surface of the dark water like a heavy blanket. They loaded their gear in total silence, the only sounds being the gentle lap of water against the hull and the low rumble of the outboard motor as they pushed away from the shore. For the first 3 hours, they cast their lines into the cold depths without speaking a single word. Arthur watched his bright red bobber drift along the current. The rhythmic, mechanical action of casting and reeling acted as a balm. The biting wind off the Cascade foothills flushed his cheeks, pulling him out of the suffocating confines of his oak study. He watched the dark silhouettes of the pine trees on the far shore, gathering the fragmented pieces of his resolve. Around noon, Frank killed the engine and let the boat drift into a quiet cove. He unscrewed the cup of a battered metal thermos, poured steaming black coffee, and handed it to Arthur. Frank leaned back against the bench seat, adjusting his worn baseball cap. He looked directly at Arthur and asked what was heavy enough to make a man look like he had just attended his own funeral. Arthur stared down at the dark liquid in his cup. He did not raise his voice. He did not tremble. With a quiet, clinical precision, he explained the phone call from Leo. He explained how Chloe had orchestrated the secret graduation party 5 weeks early. He detailed his realization that his presence was considered an embarrassment to his daughter-in-law, a glaring reminder to her country club friends of exactly who funded their pristine suburban lifestyle. He confessed his own paralyzing guilt over his years at the factory and how he had willingly allowed himself to become a permanent bank vault just to secure a seat at their dinner table. Frank listened until Arthur had completely emptied his lungs. The older man took a slow sip of his coffee. He looked out over the expanse of water, his weathered face completely unreadable. When Frank finally spoke, his words were devoid of pity. They were sharp, heavy, and absolutely necessary. Frank told Arthur that he had spent his entire career understanding the physics of load-bearing walls and structural limits. Yet, he had completely failed to apply that same logic to his own son. Frank pointed out that by constantly sweeping in to save Marcus from every financial misstep, Arthur had robbed the boy of the necessary friction required to build character. He told Arthur that he was not being generous. He was being selfish. He was buying relief from his own guilt at the expense of his son's maturity. Arthur felt a defensive flare of anger, but he swallowed it down. He knew Frank was right. Frank leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on his knees. He asked Arthur a very simple question. He asked if Arthur knew the fundamental difference between a gift and an expectation. Arthur remained silent, letting the question hang in the crisp air. Frank explained that a gift is an act of grace, something the receiver is grateful for. An expectation is a dangerous precedent. You only know a gift has become an expectation, Frank said, when the other person gets angry the moment you stop giving it. The older man paused, letting the truth sink into the marrow of Arthur's bones. Frank stated that Marcus would likely not notice if Arthur stopped calling to chat about the weather, but Marcus would absolutely panic the moment the checking account ran dry. Frank looked Arthur dead in the eye and told him that a father's greatest and most painful responsibility was knowing when to let his child fall. The words echoed in the stillness of the cove. Arthur looked out at the vast, indifferent lake. The chaotic storm of betrayal and hurt that had consumed him all morning began to solidify into a cold, unbreakable foundation. He realized that confronting Marcus in a state of fresh anger would only lead to a screaming match, a defensive wall of excuses. He needed to be perfectly calm. He needed Marcus to sit in the quiet and wonder exactly what his father knew. Arthur finished his coffee and picked up his fishing rod. He told Frank he was going to call his son, but he was going to wait a few days. He was going to let the silence do the heavy lifting first. Frank simply nodded, turned the key in the ignition, and steered the boat back toward the open water. For the first time that day, Arthur felt the crushing weight of his guilt begin to lift, replaced by the quiet, terrifying clarity of what he had to do next. Arthur waited exactly 4 days before he picked up the receiver. He spent Monday and Tuesday restoring the old wooden deck behind his house, letting the physical labor smooth out the jagged edges of his thoughts. By Wednesday evening, the turbulent anger that had seized him over the weekend had hardened into a cold, impenetrable calm. He sat in the worn leather chair in his study, watching the sun dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the floorboards. The yellow legal pad was locked away in the bottom drawer. He did not need to look at the numbers anymore. They were permanently etched into his mind. He dialed Marcus's number at 7:15. He chose the time deliberately. It was late enough that Marcus would be home from the marketing firm, likely sitting in the lavish living room Arthur had helped furnish, but early enough that dinner would still be cooking. The phone rang 3 times. When Marcus finally answered, his voice carried a very specific, careful quality. It was not quite guilty, but it lacked the casual warmth of a son answering his father's call. Marcus asked how things were going in Bend. Arthur kept his voice perfectly level, maintaining the steady cadence of a man who held all the cards. He replied that the weather was turning pleasant and the lake was quiet. He let a brief silence stretch between them, forcing Marcus to bear the weight of the unspoken tension. Then, with surgical precision, Arthur initiated the confrontation. He told Marcus that Leo had phoned him on Sunday morning. He kept his tone pleasant, almost conversational. He mentioned that the boy sounded absolutely thrilled. He said Leo had described the lights, the food, and the beautiful waterfront venue. Arthur paused, taking a slow, measured breath. He said it sounded like a truly beautiful night. The silence that followed from the other end of the line was absolute. Arthur sat in his study and literally counted the seconds in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4. It was the suffocating silence of a man realizing the floor had just vanished beneath his feet. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice cracked slightly. He said the word "Dad," and then he stopped. Arthur did not offer a lifeline. He leaned forward in his leather chair and asked his son a very simple, direct question. He asked when exactly Marcus had been planning to tell him that his only grandson's graduation celebration, the event Arthur had fully funded, had taken place without him. What followed was one of the most agonizing conversations of Arthur's adult life. It was not painful because Marcus screamed or became instantly defensive. It was painful because Arthur had to sit and listen to a grown man, a father of 2, stumble through a thicket of cowardly lies. First came the panicked scramble for a logistical excuse. Marcus's words tumbled out in a rushed, frantic stream. He claimed there had been a massive miscommunication. He said the event coordinator at the waterfront venue had called them in a panic in late April. There had supposedly been a double booking issue, a sudden cancellation, and an earlier date had miraculously become available. Marcus insisted that if they did not take the May date, they would have lost the venue entirely. Arthur listened to the desperate fabrication without interrupting. He pictured his son pacing the hardwood floors of the Lake Oswego house, sweating under the pressure of his own deceit. Marcus continued, his voice adopting a pleading quality. He blamed the chaos of rescheduling. He blamed the stress of Chloe's part-time job at the yoga studio and Leo's final exams. He said everything had happened so incredibly fast that in the blur of printing new invitations and coordinating with the caterers, he had simply forgotten to update Arthur about the date change. He said he was incredibly sorry. He said he assumed his father would understand how hectic things had been. Arthur let the flimsy excuse hang in the air until it rotted. Then, he methodically dismantled it. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet authority of an engineer pointing out a fatal flaw in a blueprint. He reminded Marcus that he had wired $40,000 of his own retirement savings to make the evening possible. He reminded him that they had spoken on the phone 3 times in the month of April. He pointed out that he had booked a flight from Redmond to Seattle. He noted that he had a non-refundable reservation at a premium hotel for the second week of June. Arthur asked why Marcus had not picked up the phone the very minute the venue supposedly changed the date. He asked why there had been no text message. He asked why there had been no email, no forwarded itinerary, absolutely nothing. To forget to call a distant relative was understandable. To forget to call the man who was paying for the entire spectacle, the grandfather who had explicitly asked to be involved, was statistically impossible. Marcus stammered. The logistical lie was crumbling rapidly under the weight of basic logic. He tried to reiterate how stressed Chloe had been, trying to use his wife's anxiety as a shield. But Arthur refused to accept the deflection. He told Marcus very clearly that he did not understand. He told his son that forgetting was an accident, but keeping a secret for 5 weeks was a deliberate choice. The air in Arthur's study grew colder. He waited. He knew the first layer of defense had been breached. The logistical lie was dead. Now, they were standing at the precipice of the real reason, and Arthur could hear his son struggling to find a way to make the truth sound survivable. Marcus finally stopped talking. The frantic energy drained out of the phone line, leaving behind a heavy, defeated exhaustion. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted entirely. It adopted a terrible, calculated honesty. It was the specific tone a man uses when he decides a partial truth is much easier to survive than a complete, undeniable lie. He called Arthur Dad again, his voice dropping an octave, trying to manufacture a sense of intimacy that no longer existed between them. He said that Chloe had been extremely stressed about the family dynamic. Arthur asked him to explain exactly what dynamic meant. He refused to let Marcus hide behind vague therapy words. Marcus stumbled over his syllables. He said Chloe wanted the night to be entirely about Leo. She did not want Arthur taking over the event. She was afraid Arthur would stand up, make some grand, emotional speech, and make the whole evening about the immense financial contribution he had made. She wanted a pure family night, Marcus claimed, without that specific, heavy energy hanging over the dinner tables. Arthur let the insult land. It felt like a physical blow to his ribs, a sharp ache that radiated outward. He sat in the dim light of his study and absorbed the staggering fact that his daughter-in-law viewed him as a boorish, attention-seeking benefactor. He spoke very slowly, ensuring every single word was completely clear and sharp. He told Marcus that he had been present for every significant milestone in his son's 41 years of life. He had attended graduations, weddings, baptisms, and birthdays. He told Marcus he had never once stood up at any gathering and demanded recognition for his wallet. He asked his son to name one single occasion, just one, where he had done what Chloe accused him of doing. Marcus could not give him one. The silence on the line was profound and absolute. The defensive wall had completely collapsed. Arthur pressed harder, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. He told Marcus that they both knew that was not the real reason. He demanded the actual truth, systematically stripping away the last fragile layers of Marcus's dignity. Then the final, rotten layer peeled away. Marcus surrendered. His voice broke into a hollow, shameful whisper. He confessed that Chloe had invited several of her own friends to the graduation party. She had invited affluent women from the elite yoga studio she attended and wealthy couples from the Lake Oswego Country Club they desperately tried to impress. These were people who firmly believed Marcus and Chloe were an entirely self-sufficient, brilliant couple living out the pinnacle of the American dream. Marcus swallowed hard, the sound audible through the receiver. He admitted that a few of these high society friends had heard rumors over the years. They had heard quiet, polite whispers about how much financial support Arthur Sterling had provided to keep his son's lavish lifestyle afloat. Chloe was deeply, fiercely embarrassed by those rumors. She was terrified that having Arthur at the party, sitting prominently at the head table, would serve as a glaring, undeniable confirmation of their ugly secret. Arthur listened as the ugliest truth of all finally came into the harsh light. Chloe had not excluded him because she feared he would embarrass the family with an awkward speech. She had excluded him because his very existence humiliated her. His presence would remind her wealthy friends, and perhaps remind Chloe herself, that the beautiful house, the luxury cars, and the $40,000 party were all built on money they had not earned. They wanted the glittering, expensive facade of his wealth, but they wanted to completely and utterly erase the man who provided it. They had hidden him in the dark so the guests would never see the foundation. Marcus sounded utterly pathetic as he finished the brutal confession. He said he had gone along with the lie because Chloe had been so anxious, and he just wanted to keep the peace in his own house. He had willfully sacrificed his father's love and presence to appease his wife's endless, bottomless vanity. He had chosen the illusion over the reality. Arthur did not yell. He did not curse. The cold calm that had settled over him after the fishing trip with Frank held firm, wrapping around him like an armor of ice. He felt a strange, detached pity for the man on the other end of the phone. A man who would trade his own father's dignity to protect a country club illusion was a man who had already lost everything of real, tangible value. Arthur thanked his son for finally being honest. The pristine politeness in Arthur's voice was far more devastating than any screaming match could have ever been. Marcus started to apologize again, his voice rising in panic, begging Arthur to understand the immense social pressure he was under. But Arthur gently and firmly cut him off. He told Marcus that he needed a considerable amount of time to think about everything that had been said. Without waiting for another hollow apology or another pathetic excuse, Arthur pressed the red button on his phone. The connection severed instantly. The study returned to its perfect, unbroken quiet. Arthur sat alone in the fading light, looking at the dark screen of his device. The truth was completely bare now, stripped of all excuses, logistical lies, and polite fictions. The 12-year contract of financial dependency had reached its absolute end. Arthur knew exactly what he had to do next, and the realization brought him a profound, unexpected sense of peace. The click of the disconnected call echoed in Arthur's mind long after the room had fallen completely silent. He remained in his leather chair, the fading twilight casting long, distorted shadows across the oak floorboards. For the first time since the morning Leo had called, Arthur allowed himself to truly break down. He did not weep loudly. He simply bent forward, resting his face in his calloused hands, and let the crushing weight of his failure wash over him. He mourned the death of an illusion. He grieved for the father and son relationship he had desperately tried to purchase, realizing now that it had never truly existed. When Arthur finally lifted his head, the study was completely dark. The tears had dried, leaving his face feeling tight and cold. The profound sadness had entirely burned itself out, leaving behind a sterile, clinical clarity. He understood now that he was not a benefactor. He was an enabler. His son and daughter-in-law were addicts, completely dependent on the intoxicating high of a lifestyle they could not afford, and Arthur had been their willing supplier for 12 years. The only cure for an addiction was total, uncompromising withdrawal. The following morning, Arthur initiated his iron discipline. He brewed his black coffee, sat at his computer, and logged into his retirement banking portal. His movements were mechanical and precise. First, he navigated to the joint emergency credit card account, the one he had opened when Marcus lost his job briefly 8 years ago, the one Chloe still regularly used for spontaneous spa weekends and premium groceries. With 3 clicks, Arthur revoked their authorized user status and permanently closed the account. Next, he canceled the recurring monthly transfer he had established to assist with their exorbitant utility bills and property taxes. He watched the digital confirmation flash on the screen, feeling a phantom ache in his chest. A massive, invisible cord connecting him to Lake Oswego had just been severed. He was cutting the oxygen line to their artificial atmosphere. The true test of his resolve arrived 2 weeks later. It was the middle of June, marking the 16th birthday of his granddaughter, Emma. For her entire life, Emma's birthdays had been highly anticipated financial events orchestrated by Chloe. Arthur had historically covered the costs of lavish bounce house parties, catered pool gatherings, and, most recently, expensive designer wardrobes. He knew exactly what Chloe expected this year. She expected a check with 3 zeros to help fund a luxury car, or perhaps an extravagant Sweet 16 gala at the country club. Arthur drove to a local pharmacy in Bend. He stood in the greeting card aisle for 20 minutes, reading through dozens of glossy paper squares until he found one with a simple watercolor painting of a mountain lake. He took it home, sat at his kitchen table, and wrote a deeply affectionate note. He told Emma how proud he was of the intelligent, kind young woman she was becoming. He signed it with all his love. Then, he sealed the envelope. He did not include a check. He did not slip a $100 bill inside. He placed a single postage stamp in the corner and dropped it in the blue mailbox at the end of his street. Walking back to his house, Arthur felt a sickening knot of guilt form in his stomach. Every instinct he had cultivated over the past decade screamed at him to go back, tear the envelope open, and write the check. He felt like he was actively harming his own grandchild. But the harsh wisdom of his friend Frank echoed in his mind. If he paid for Emma's affection now, he was only perpetuating the cycle of transactional love that had ruined his son. He had to trust that his words held value without a monetary attachment. It did not take long for the tremors of the withdrawal to reach Bend. 3 days after Emma's birthday, the silence from Lake Oswego broke, but it did not come in the form of an apology. It came as a series of calculated, probing text messages from Marcus. The first message arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while Arthur was reading on his back deck. It was a cowardly, passive attempt to test the waters. Marcus wrote that Emma had received the card and said thank you, followed by a casual remark noting that Arthur must have forgotten to include the usual gift. Arthur stared at the glowing screen of his smartphone. He read the words twice, feeling a wave of disgust at his son's transparent greed. He set the phone face down on the wooden table and did not reply. 2 days later, another message illuminated the screen. Marcus adopted a tone of manufactured concern. He asked if Arthur was feeling all right, mentioning that it was highly unusual for him to be this quiet. He asked if the cell service was acting up in the mountains. The following weekend, the texts became slightly more frantic, abandoning the pretense of casual conversation. Marcus pleaded for a phone call, stating that Chloe was very confused about the deactivated credit card and wondering if there had been a bank error. Arthur stood in his kitchen, watching the small notifications stack up on his phone screen. They were the desperate, thrashing movements of a system realizing it had been unplugged. A year ago, Arthur would have instantly called back, apologizing profusely for any perceived slight, eager to smooth over the tension with a fresh transfer of funds. Today, he simply reached out, turned the device on silent, and walked away. The detox had officially begun, and Arthur knew the symptoms were only going to get worse before the fever finally broke. 3 weeks passed. 21 days of absolute, unbroken silence. After the initial barrage of frantic text messages and missed calls from Marcus, the digital notifications simply ceased. It was as if a heavy velvet curtain had fallen between Bend and Lake Oswego. Arthur Sterling woke up every morning to a quiet house, brewed his black coffee, and stared at a phone screen that remained entirely blank. The silence was far more difficult to endure than the anger. For 12 years, Arthur had conditioned his nervous system to anticipate the next disaster. He had lived in a perpetual state of financial vigilance, always waiting for the inevitable phone call detailing a broken water heater, a sudden tuition hike, or a car that needed an emergency transmission rebuild. He had built his entire post-retirement identity around being the ultimate problem solver. He was the vault. He was the safety net. Without a crisis to manage, Arthur found himself standing in his spacious kitchen, feeling completely untethered. The first week was agonizing. Arthur experienced the visceral, psychological withdrawal of an enabler who had suddenly lost his dependence. He caught himself pacing the hardwood floors of his hallway, phantom phone calls ringing in his ears. He would reach for his device out of pure muscle memory, his thumb hovering over the banking application icon, fighting the overwhelming urge to check Marcus and Chloe's joint accounts out of deeply ingrained habit. He had to actively force himself to put the phone back down. He felt a deep, knowing guilt, a whispering voice in the back of his mind that accused him of abandoning his family. He worried about Emma and Leo. He wondered if Chloe was making Marcus miserable because the luxury credit card was no longer active. He wondered if they were drowning in bills. But every time the urge to cave in threatened to overwhelm him, Arthur remembered the cold, calculated honesty in his son's voice. He remembered that his presence at a celebration was considered a social liability. He reminded himself that he was not withholding love. He was withholding poison. By the middle of the second week, the suffocating anxiety began to fracture, letting in small, unexpected slivers of light. Arthur realized he had not checked his email for invoices in 10 days. He realized he had not mentally calculated his monthly budget to accommodate a sudden request from Lake Oswego. For the first time in over a decade, his money was entirely his own. His time was entirely his own. He started to establish a new rhythm, one that did not revolve around his son's financial shortfalls. He began waking up just as the sun broke over the Cascade Peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of bruised purple and gold. He took long, deliberate walks along the edge of the lake, listening to the gravel crunch beneath his boots and the sharp cries of the ospreys diving for fish. He breathed in the scent of damp pine needles and cold, fresh water, feeling the crisp air clear the stagnant dust from his lungs. He stopped eating quick, utilitarian meals over the kitchen sink. Instead, Arthur drove into town and visited the local farmer's market. He bought fresh vegetables, thick cuts of meat, and crusty loaves of bread. He spent his evenings meticulously chopping, seasoning, and roasting, turning the simple act of preparing dinner into a mindful ritual. He sat at his dining table, poured himself a glass of red wine, and ate in silence. He did not eat while waiting for the phone to ring. He just ate. He began to read again, pulling thick historical biographies off the shelves of his study, the yellow legal pad safely locked away and forgotten. He spent a weekend helping Frank rebuild the carburetor on the old aluminum skiff, his hands covered in grease and smelling of gasoline, feeling a deep, tactile satisfaction he had not experienced since his days at the Boeing assembly plant. He laughed at Frank's dry, cynical jokes, the sound rumbling from his chest, unfamiliar but deeply welcome. As the third week drew to a close, Arthur stood on his back deck, leaning against the wooden railing he had recently restored. The summer night was cool and incredibly clear, a vast canopy of stars stretching over the dark silhouette of the mountains. He realized with a profound sense of clarity that he was no longer waiting. The knot of dread that had lived in his stomach for 12 years had completely dissolved. He was living alone, but it did not feel like a tragic sentence anymore. Solitude was no longer a punishment for failing to be a perfect father. It was a sanctuary. He had spent his youth building airplanes for strangers and his golden years building a financial fortress for an ungrateful son. Now, at 68 years old, Arthur Sterling finally belonged entirely to himself. He felt a profound, complicated peace settling over his property, knowing that whatever happened next in Lake Oswego was no longer his structural failure to fix. The late summer heat settled over Bend in a thick, golden haze. August brought a deep stillness to the lake, the water turning warm and sluggish under the relentless sun. For Arthur Sterling, the passing weeks had cemented his new reality. The profound peace he had discovered in July had hardened into a quiet, reliable foundation. He had gone nearly 3 months without a single financial transaction directed toward Lake Oswego. The frantic text messages from his son had eventually stopped, replaced by a sullen, heavy silence that Arthur had learned to accept. He spent his days reading, working on his house, and enjoying the uncomplicated company of his friend Frank. The vault was closed, and the air around him finally felt breathable. The fragile equilibrium shattered on a sweltering Wednesday evening. Arthur was standing at his kitchen counter, slicing a ripe tomato from the local market, when his cell phone began to vibrate against the granite. He looked at the glowing screen and saw his son's name. It had been over 8 weeks since they last spoke. Arthur wiped his hands on a linen towel and let the device ring twice before picking it up. He did not feel the old, familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. He simply felt a cold, clinical curiosity. Marcus did not offer a polite greeting. He did not ask about the weather or how Arthur was spending his retirement. He simply said the word "Dad," and his voice sounded entirely unrecognizable. It was not the polished, carefully modulated tone of a successful marketing manager. It was tight, breathless, and laced with naked, undeniable panic. Arthur leaned against the kitchen counter, looking out the window at the fading sunlight reflecting off the water. He told his son to go ahead and speak. The words spilled out of Marcus in a rushed, frantic torrent. The polished facade had completely collapsed. Marcus explained that their mortgage was coming up for renewal at the end of the month. 5 years ago, when they bought the massive house in a prestigious neighborhood, they had opted for an adjustable rate to keep the initial payments artificially low. They had assumed they would refinance later, or that their income would magically double to cover the inevitable increase. They had used the extra money not to pay down the principal, but to lease luxury vehicles, fund country club memberships, and maintain the glossy illusion of immense wealth. Now, the financial environment had violently shifted. The interest rates had spiked, and the bank had just sent the new payment schedule. Marcus's voice cracked as he revealed the numbers. The monthly payment was increasing by over $1,500. Arthur listened in absolute silence. He could hear the terrifying reality closing in on his son. Marcus sounded like a man standing on the tracks, watching a freight train barrel toward him, completely paralyzed. Marcus tried to justify the panic, listing the crushing weight of their expenses. He talked about the soaring cost of premium groceries, the exorbitant gas prices for Chloe's heavy luxury SUV, the private school fees for Emma, and the sheer cost of maintaining their social standing. He admitted they had absolutely zero savings. Every single dollar they earned was already spent before it hit their checking account. They had been trying to absorb the rising costs by putting expenses on high-interest credit cards, hoping to just stay afloat. But the sudden, massive jump in the mortgage payment was the final, fatal blow to their fragile ecosystem. They were entirely tapped out. If they missed the new payments, they would lose the house. The underlying tragedy of the situation was painfully clear to Arthur. The house in Lake Oswego was not just a shelter to them. It was their entire identity. Losing it meant losing their status, their wealthy friends, and the carefully curated image Chloe had spent over a decade building. It would be a total, humiliating public failure. Marcus finally stopped making excuses. He took a shaky, ragged breath, the sound echoing through the receiver. He asked his father the question that had been hovering in the air since the moment the call connected. He asked if Arthur would consider helping them with a lump sum to buy down the interest rate points with the bank. He had run the panicked math all week. If they could just provide a substantial cash injection right now, the bank would adjust the terms, and they could keep the house. He said the number very quickly, the way a person says something when they have been rehearsing it for days and want to expel it from their mouth before their nerve entirely fails. $30,000. He needed $30,000 immediately. Arthur did not speak. He stood perfectly still in his kitchen, the silver knife resting beside the sliced tomato on the cutting board. He pictured his son sitting in that sprawling, empty house, terrified of the impending collapse. He knew with absolute certainty that Chloe was likely standing just outside the room, waiting for her husband to extract the miracle cure from the grandfather she had deemed too embarrassing to invite to a party. Marcus filled the silence with a desperate, pleading whisper. He promised they would pay it back. He promised they would restructure their budget, sell one of the cars, and finally learn to live within their means. He swore that this would be the absolute last time he ever asked for anything. He begged his father to save them from ruin. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating, bridging the geographical distance between the mountains of Bend and the affluent suburbs of Portland. Arthur held the phone to his ear, absorbing the sheer weight of his son's desperation, knowing that the next words he spoke would permanently alter the trajectory of their lives. The heavy silence stretched across the cellular connection. Arthur stood in his kitchen in Bend, looking at the sliced tomato on the cutting board, the fading evening light casting long shadows across the granite counter. He heard his son breathing shallowly on the other end of the line, a man entirely consumed by the terror of his own impending ruin. Marcus was waiting for the familiar, comforting sound of capitulation. He was waiting for his father to sigh, complain mildly about their spending habits, and then ask for the routing number to wire the $30,000. Arthur took a slow, deep breath. He did not feel angry. He felt a profound, aching sorrow for the grown man on the phone. He spoke his son's name quietly. He told Marcus that before he gave an answer regarding the mortgage, he needed to ask one question. He demanded that Marcus answer it with absolute, uncompromising honesty. Marcus swallowed hard. He said okay, his voice barely more than a whisper. Arthur kept his tone perfectly level, devoid of any malice but carrying the weight of an anvil. He asked if Marcus and Chloe had made a conscious, deliberate decision to hold Leo's graduation party without telling him. He clarified that he did not want to hear about miscommunications or chaotic schedules. He wanted to know, right then and there, if the exclusion was a calculated choice to hide him from the country club friends. The silence returned, thicker and more suffocating than before. Marcus was trapped. He knew that lying now, when he was begging for $30,000, would be catastrophic. He also knew that admitting the ugly truth out loud, without any protective padding, would strip away the last shred of his dignity. Yes, Marcus finally whispered. The single word sounded like it had been dragged out of his throat over broken glass. He added that it was Chloe's idea, and he had simply gone along with it because it was easier than fighting her. He admitted he never should have done it. Arthur closed his eyes. Hearing the naked truth confirmed, without any surrounding excuses, brought a strange sense of finality. He opened his eyes and looked out at the darkening lake. He thanked Marcus for telling the truth. Then, with the calm, steady precision of an engineer permanently condemning a faulty structure, Arthur delivered his verdict. He said he was not going to help with the mortgage. Marcus let out a sharp, ragged exhalation, as if he had just been punched in the stomach. He started to panic again, his voice rising in pitch, begging Arthur to reconsider, pleading that they would lose the house, the neighborhood, everything they had built. Arthur cut him off gently but firmly. He told his son to listen very carefully. He explained that this refusal was not an act of revenge. It was not a punishment for the graduation party. He said he had thought about this dynamic every single day for the past 3 months. He told Marcus that for 12 years, he had stepped in every single time Marcus and Chloe reached the absolute edge of their financial capabilities. Every single time, without exception, Arthur had arrived with a checkbook to smooth over the consequences of their reckless choices. Arthur gripped the edge of the granite counter. He confessed his own culpability. He told Marcus that by constantly playing the savior, he had actively removed any incentive for Marcus to build a solid financial foundation. He pointed out that Marcus earned an excellent salary at the marketing firm. Chloe earned decent money at the yoga studio. They had a combined income that placed them firmly in the upper middle class. There is absolutely no reason, Arthur said, none at all, why a man in his early 40s with a massive household income should be $30,000 short for a mortgage adjustment. The only reason Marcus was facing this catastrophe was because he had never been forced to be responsible. He had never had to face the terror of an empty bank account because his father had always been standing right behind him, ready to catch him before he hit the ground. Marcus did not say a word. The truth of the statement was absolute and undeniable. Arthur let his voice soften, letting the genuine love he held for his family bleed into his words. He told Marcus that he loved him. He said he loved Chloe, despite everything. He said he loved Leo and Emma more than words could adequately express. He assured his son that none of this financial separation changed that fundamental truth. However, Arthur continued, he was 68 years old. He had his own retirement, his own peace of mind, and his own life to protect. More importantly, he had finally understood that the most loving thing he could possibly do for his son right now was to completely stop. He told Marcus that the financial arrangement they had maintained for over a decade was officially over. He articulated the boundary with absolute clarity. It was not reduced. It was not restructured. It was finished. Marcus sounded utterly hollowed out. He asked in a weak, trembling voice if they could talk more about it later. Arthur replied that his door was always open for a conversation. He promised he would always be a father to Marcus, and the relationship between them did not have to end. But the bank vault was permanently closed. Marcus said he needed time to think. Arthur said he understood completely. They said goodbye, and Arthur pressed the red button to end the call. He set the phone down on the counter next to the sliced tomato. He walked into his living room and sat in his favorite leather chair, listening to the neighborhood settle into the quiet of the evening. A dog barks somewhere down the street. The light outside his window shifted from vibrant orange to the deep, bruising purple of a high desert twilight. He watched the colors change over the Cascade Peaks, and for the first time in his life, Arthur Sterling felt entirely unburdened. The weeks following the final phone call were some of the most difficult of Arthur Sterling's life. He had delivered his verdict, but executing the sentence required an agonizing, daily discipline. It was one thing to declare an end to the financial rescue missions in a moment of absolute clarity. It was an entirely different ordeal to sit in the quiet of his Bend home, knowing with absolute certainty that his son's artificial world was violently collapsing just a few hundred miles away. News of the fallout in Lake Oswego filtered back to Arthur in fractured, painful pieces. Marcus called only once in late August. His voice lacked the frantic panic of their previous conversation. Instead, it carried the hollow, exhausted weight of a man who had finally hit the ground. Marcus informed his father that they had managed to keep the massive house, but the cost of survival had been absolute and publicly humiliating. The material losses were staggering. They had been forced to sell Chloe's imported luxury sport utility vehicle. The massive car, long the gleaming symbol of her manufactured status, had been sold back to the dealership at a significant loss. It was replaced by a modest, 7-year-old sedan with faded paint. Marcus had been forced to liquidate the small college fund he had barely started for his daughter just to cover the immediate mortgage deficit. Most devastating of all to their social standing, the prestigious country club membership, the very epicenter of Chloe's universe, had been quietly terminated due to unpaid dues. Marcus did not speak of his wife with any of his usual protective affection. He mentioned, his voice tight with unspoken resentment, that Chloe had been forced to beg the yoga studio owner for full-time hours. The glamorous illusion of the wealthy, leisurely suburban housewife had shattered overnight. She was now a woman working double shifts, returning home exhausted and bitter, to help pay off a mountain of crushing credit card debt. The wealthy friends she had desperately tried to impress at the secret graduation party, the people she had hidden her father-in-law from, had predictably vanished the moment the facade cracked and the expensive lunches stopped. Listening to his son detail this humiliating restructuring, Arthur felt a primal, biological urge to intervene. Every paternal instinct he had cultivated over 12 years screamed at him to open his vault. He sat in his study, staring at the locked bottom drawer of his oak desk that held his checkbook. He knew he possessed the power to instantly erase their suffering. He could easily buy back Chloe's car. He could anonymously reinstate the country club membership. He could make the crushing pressure stop with a few strokes of his silver pen. The torment of watching his child struggle, even a child who had betrayed him, was a physical ache radiating through his chest. Sleep became difficult. Arthur would lie awake in the dark, listening to the wind rattle the windows, haunted by the thought of his grandchildren caught in the crossfire of their parents' financial ruin. He worried about Emma navigating the brutal social hierarchy of her high school without her designer clothes. He imagined the sprawling house in Lake Oswego echoing with the vicious, desperate arguments between Marcus and Chloe as the reality of their poverty set in. There were moments when Arthur genuinely thought he would break. He would reach for his phone, ready to dial his son's number and offer a small lifeline, just a temporary bridge to ease the transition. But every time his finger hovered over the screen, he remembered the cold truth. He remembered the $250,000 that had bought nothing but disrespect. He remembered Frank's sharp wisdom about the difference between a gift and an expectation. He forced himself to put the phone down. He physically walked away from the desk. He reminded himself that rescuing them now would render the entire agonizing ordeal completely meaningless. It would teach Marcus that consequences were only temporary illusions, and that his father's boundaries were ultimately fragile. He chose the infinitely harder path. He offered Marcus words of quiet encouragement during their brief call, acknowledging the immense difficulty of the situation, but he did not offer a single cent. He told his son that he believed in his ability to figure it out. When the conversation ended, Arthur walked out to his back deck. The air was turning crisp, signaling the inevitable approach of autumn. He felt like a surgeon who had just performed a necessary amputation without anesthesia. It was gruesome, and the patient was screaming in agony, but it was the only possible way to save the rest of the body from the spreading rot. Marcus was finally learning the true weight of a dollar, the agonizing cost of vanity, and the necessary, unavoidable friction of adulthood. Arthur watched the wind ripple across the dark surface of the lake. He knew the scar tissue forming over his relationship with his son would be thick and permanent. He accepted that Chloe would likely harbor a deep, venomous hatred for him for the rest of her life. He made his peace with being the villain in her narrative. He was no longer playing a supporting role in their artificial play. He was standing on solid ground, and by refusing to catch his son, he was finally forcing Marcus to find his own floor. The late summer heat finally broke in the second week of September, replaced by the crisp, rain-washed air of the Pacific Northwest. For Arthur Sterling, the changing of the seasons brought a welcome shift in focus. The agonizing daily discipline of ignoring the fallout in Lake Oswego was temporarily suspended. It was time to drive north. His grandson, Leo, was beginning his freshman year at the University of Washington in Seattle, and Arthur had promised months ago to help him move into his dormitory. Arthur packed a small overnight bag, loaded it into his truck, and began the long drive up the interstate. The journey gave him ample time to reflect. He had not seen Leo since the brief, awkward family dinner during the winter holidays the previous year, long before the secret graduation party and the subsequent financial severing. He harbored a quiet anxiety about how the tension between him and Marcus might have infected his relationship with his grandson. He wondered what narrative Chloe had spun to explain the sudden disappearance of the grandfather who used to fund their every whim. He arrived at the sprawling university campus in the early afternoon. The air was thick with the chaotic energy of hundreds of anxious freshmen and tearful parents. Arthur navigated the crowded parking lots until he spotted Leo standing next to a rented moving van, looking overwhelmed but undeniably excited. When Leo saw his grandfather, a genuine, unguarded smile broke across his face. He jogged over and pulled Arthur into a tight embrace. In that single, unhesitating hug, Arthur felt a massive weight lift from his shoulders. The toxic politics of Lake Oswego had not corrupted the boy. For the next 3 hours, they worked side by side. Arthur, despite his 68 years, carried heavy cardboard boxes and plastic storage bins up 3 flights of narrow, echoing concrete stairs. He helped assemble a flimsy desk lamp, organized textbooks on a narrow shelf, and showed Leo how to properly secure a loose bed frame. The physical labor was deeply satisfying. It was tactile, immediate, and required no financial transactions. He was not writing a check to hire a moving company. He was offering his time, his sweat, and his presence. He was being a grandfather in the most fundamental, traditional sense of the word. By 7 o'clock in the evening, the small dorm room was fully unpacked, and both men were exhausted and starving. Arthur did not suggest finding an upscale steakhouse in downtown Seattle. Instead, they walked 2 blocks off campus and found a tiny, dimly lit Thai restaurant wedged between a used bookstore and a laundromat. The tables were slightly sticky, the air smelled intensely of basil and roasting chilies, and the menu was printed on laminated paper. They sat in a corner booth, ordered far too much food, and ate with the ravenous appetite of laborers. They spent the first hour talking about everything and nothing. Leo animatedly discussed his upcoming course schedule, his slight intimidation regarding a massive biology lecture, and the eccentricities of his new roommate. Arthur listened intently, asking questions, offering gentle advice, and simply enjoying the vibrant cadence of the young man's voice. He noticed Leo had inherited his father's laugh, a deep, resonant sound that brought back a sudden, sharp pang of nostalgia for the boy Marcus used to be. As the waitress cleared their empty plates, the easy, casual atmosphere shifted. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background. Leo picked at a stray grain of rice on the table, his expression turning unusually serious. He looked up at Arthur, his eyes reflecting a maturity that Arthur had not fully recognized before. Leo cleared his throat and spoke softly. He said he knew things had been incredibly strange with his father lately. He admitted he did not know the specific details, and he did not want to pry into adult business, but he was acutely aware that a massive rift had opened up between his father and his grandfather. Arthur kept his face perfectly neutral, waiting. He did not want to burden the boy with the ugly truth of the ledger, the lies, or the country club vanity. Leo leaned forward slightly. He brought up the graduation party. He said his dad had told him there was a terrible misunderstanding with the dates, but Leo said he was old enough to know when he was being fed a sanitized version of the truth. He looked directly into Arthur's eyes and delivered a statement that completely dismantled the last remaining traces of Arthur's lingering guilt. Leo said that he wanted his grandfather to know something important. He said the waterfront venue was beautiful and the food was great, but the entire night felt completely wrong. He told Arthur that looking out at the tables and not seeing him there made the whole celebration feel hollow. He said, with absolute, unwavering sincerity, that it should have been his grandfather sitting right at the head table. He told Arthur that he was the reason any of them had the lives they had, and a party without him was just a meaningless room full of strangers. Arthur felt a sudden, intense pressure behind his eyes. He reached across the small, sticky table and placed his weathered hand over his grandson's. He did not try to explain the past, and he did not speak ill of Marcus or Chloe. He simply looked at the 18-year-old man sitting across from him and told him the absolute truth. Arthur said that the only thing in the entire world that mattered to him was the dinner they were having right now. He told Leo that sitting in this tiny restaurant, watching him begin the next great chapter of his life, was worth infinitely more than any catered event or expensive venue. He said he was proud of Leo in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with money, prestige, or outward appearances. They walked back toward the campus dormitories under the glow of the amber streetlights. The September air was cold, but Arthur felt an immense, radiating warmth in his chest. The $40,000 party had been a monument to Chloe's vanity, a shallow performance designed for an audience of strangers. But this $30 meal of noodles and shared honesty was a monument to real, enduring love. Arthur realized that by closing his vault, he had not lost his family. He had simply burned away the artificial rot, leaving behind the pure, unbreakable bond that truly mattered. Several months slipped away after that quiet evening in Seattle. Winter returned to Bend, covering the Oregon landscape in a pristine layer of heavy white snow. Arthur Sterling stood by the vast windows of his living room, a steaming mug of black coffee warming his hands. He watched the early morning light slowly paint the jagged peaks of the Cascade Mountains in pale shades of pink and gold. The world outside was perfectly still, and for the first time in decades, the world inside his mind matched that profound quiet. The relationship with his son was not magically repaired. There was no tearful reunion or sudden return to the way things used to be. The scar tissue between them was thick and undeniable. They spoke on the telephone perhaps once every 3 weeks. The conversations were careful and brief, mostly centered around the weather or updates on Leo and Emma. Marcus sounded older, his voice stripped of the polished arrogance he used to carry. Through these short calls, Arthur learned that the artificial kingdom in Lake Oswego had been entirely dismantled. Marcus had taken on freelance consulting work on the weekends to help manage their crushing debt. His daughter-in-law, Chloe, was still working full-time at the yoga studio. They were undoubtedly exhausted, navigating a brutal reality they had avoided for 12 years. But they had not lost their home. They had simply lost the illusion. For the very first time in his adult life, Marcus was standing on a foundation built entirely by his own hands. Arthur took a slow sip of his coffee, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. He realized that for most of his life, he had been trapped in a terrible misunderstanding. He had spent his youth believing that providing wealth was the ultimate expression of a fatherly duty. Later, he believed that rescuing his son from every mistake was the ultimate expression of love. He had tried to grip his family so tightly with his financial resources that he had nearly suffocated them. Looking out at the mountains, he understood a deeper, more enduring truth. He saw clearly that life was not a problem to be solved with a checkbook, but an experience to be lived with all its inherent struggles. By constantly rushing in to fix his son's mistakes, he had disrupted the natural flow of their lives. He had acted out of fear, the fear of not being needed, the fear of losing connection. But acting out of fear never produces genuine love. It only produces dependency. Now, by choosing to step aside, he had allowed the muddy waters of their relationship to finally settle. The clarity that followed was uncomfortable, but it was entirely real. The hardest and most beautiful act of love was not control. It was letting go. It was stepping back and allowing the people you love to experience the friction of life, trusting that they possessed the strength to survive the fall. He had spent $250,000 trying to buy a peace that could only be found by simply releasing his grip. Now, standing alone in the quiet dawn, he was no longer an enabler. He was just a grandfather, a father, and a man who finally belonged entirely to the present moment. The heavy ledger of guilt was gone, replaced by the simple, enduring beauty of the morning light. Every family carries its own hidden struggles, and the lines between generosity and enabling can easily become blurred. The story of Arthur Sterling serves as a powerful reminder that true love does not always mean shielding our loved ones from every hardship. Sometimes, the most valuable gift we can offer is the space for them to grow, to stumble, and to discover their own resilience. Money can build a house, but it can never build the character required to maintain a home. When we confuse financial support with emotional connection, we risk robbing our children of their independence. True human value lies not in what we can constantly provide, but in a quiet faith we have in each other to overcome adversity. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with others so we can continue bringing you compelling and emotional stories every single day. How did Arthur's journey make you feel? Can you relate to this delicate balance between helping and holding back in your own real life? We truly want to hear from you. Please share your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments section below, so we can listen to the deepest feelings from your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every single day. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.